The morning rush at Sunrise Diner was in full swing when Williams pushed through the glass doors at exactly 7:15 a.m. The small bell above the entrance chimed softly, but no one looked up. Everyone was too busy with their own morning routines to notice the man in the expensive charcoal suit who had just walked in. Paused just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the familiar scene. The red vinyl booths were mostly occupied by construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts before heading to job sites, office workers checking their phones while sipping coffee, and a few elderly regulars who had been coming to this place for decades. The air smelled of bacon, coffee, and pancakes, a comforting mixture that reminded him of simpler times. He had discovered this little diner 3 months ago, quite by accident. His driver had taken a wrong turn during rush hour traffic, and they had ended up in this working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of downtown Chicago. While waiting for the GPS to recalculate their route, had noticed the small restaurant with its hand-painted sign, and decided to step inside for a quick coffee. That decision had changed his entire morning routine. Williams was worth approximately $2.8 billion. He owned a chain of luxury hotels, several real estate development companies, and had investments in technology firms that most people had never heard of but used every day. His penthouse apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, and he owned homes in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. Yet here he was, 3 months later, still coming to this modest diner every Tuesday and Thursday morning. The reason was simple. It was the only place where no one knew who he was and no one cared. At board meetings, charity galas, and business dinners, was constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, connections, endorsements, investments. There was always an agenda behind every smile and handshake. But here at Sunrise Diner, he was just another customer in a good suit who left decent tips. This morning, however, something felt different. Made his way to his usual booth in the back corner, the one that gave him a clear view of the entire restaurant while keeping him somewhat hidden from the street. He set his briefcase beside him and pulled out his phone to review the day's schedule. 3 board meetings, a lunch with potential investors, and a charity dinner where he was expected to write a substantial check. A coffee hun looked up to see the regular morning waitress standing beside his table with a steaming pot. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of dealing with customers. She had been serving him for the past 3 months, always friendly but never intrusive. "Please," replied, turning his cup right side up. "And the usual breakfast." "2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and turkey bacon coming right up," said, filling his cup with practiced ease. "You're here a little later than usual today." Glanced at his expensive watch. It was true, normally he arrived by 7:00 a.m. sharp. "Board meeting got moved up an hour," he explained. "Had to adjust my schedule." Nodded knowingly. She had never asked what he did for work, but his clothes and demeanor suggested he was some kind of businessman. "Well, we'll get you fed and out the door in no time," she said with a smile before heading back toward the kitchen. As sipped his coffee and scrolled through his emails, He became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. Someone was limping slightly as they moved between tables, but he was too focused on a particularly complicated contract dispute to pay much attention. It wasn't until several minutes later, when a shadow fell across his table, that looked up from his phone. Standing beside his booth was a young black woman he had never seen before. She was wearing the standard diner uniform, a pale blue dress with white trim and a small apron. But what immediately caught his attention was the fact that she was balancing gracefully on one leg. Her left leg was missing below the knee, and she used a simple crutch for support. But it wasn't her disability that made pause. It was her face. She was probably in her mid-20s, with intelligent dark eyes and natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite the early hour and what was obviously a physically demanding job, she looked composed and professional. There was something in her expression, a mix of determination and quiet dignity, that made set down his phone and give her his full attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm sorry to bother you, but would it be okay if I sat with you for just a minute? I'm on my break and all the other tables are full." Glanced around the diner. She was right. Every booth and table was occupied, and the counter seats were all taken as well. But he also noticed something else. There were a few employees sitting at a small table near the kitchen, and they kept glancing in this direction with expressions that weren't particularly friendly. "Of course," said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please sit down." The relief that crossed her face was brief but unmistakable. She maneuvered carefully into the booth, propping her crutch against the wall beside her. Once settled, she extended her hand across the table. "I'm Kenya," she said. "Kenya Johnson, thank you so much for this. I know you probably want to eat in peace." She shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard work. And it's no problem at all. Are you new here? I haven't seen you before." "Today's my first day," Kenya admitted, smoothing her uniform nervously. "Well, my first real day. I had training yesterday, but this is my first time working the breakfast rush on my own." "How's it going so far?" asked, genuinely curious. Kenya hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where the other employees were still watching. "It's challenging," she said diplomatically. "But I really need this job, so I'm determined to make it work." Something in her tone made look more closely at the other employees. Now that he was paying attention, he could see the subtle signs of tension. The way they whispered to each other while looking in Kenya's direction. The slightly too loud comments about keeping up and pulling your weight. The way none of them had offered to help when she was clearly struggling to carry a full tray while managing her crutch. Felt a familiar anger beginning to simmer in his chest. He had built his business empire partly because he had always been good at reading people and situations. Right now, he was reading a young woman who was trying her best in a hostile work environment, surrounded by colleagues who had apparently decided she wasn't worth their support. "Have you worked in restaurants before?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. "Not exactly," Kenya said, stirring sugar into the coffee she had brought with her. "I was in college until last year, pre-med actually, but then—" She gestured vaguely toward her missing leg. "Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned me. I was in the hospital for 4 months, had 6 surgeries, and by the time I was discharged, I'd missed too much school and lost my scholarship. He found himself leaning forward slightly. I'm sorry, that must have been incredibly difficult. The hardest part wasn't learning to walk again, Kenya said with a slight smile. It was watching my whole future disappear overnight. Medical school, my residency, becoming a surgeon, all of that was gone. And the medical bills? She shook her head. Let's just say that even with insurance, bankruptcy was the only option. So you're starting over, said. Completely. I moved back in with my grandmother. She's the only family I have left. She's been amazing, but she's on a fixed income, and I can't keep being a burden. I need to find a way to support myself and maybe, eventually, figure out a new path forward. Was quiet for a moment, processing what he had heard. Here was a young woman who had lost everything, her future career, her financial security, her physical wholeness. And she was sitting across from him talking about starting over with a determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Why waitressing? He asked. Honestly, it was the only place that would hire me, Kenya said with a rueful laugh. I applied to dozens of jobs, receptionist positions, data entry, customer service, anything that didn't require standing for long periods. But as soon as they saw the crutch, suddenly the position was filled or they needed someone with more experience. That's illegal, said, his business instincts kicking in. It is, Kenya agreed. But proving discrimination is almost impossible, especially when you need a job immediately. When I saw the posting for this place, I called ahead and was honest about my disability. The manager, mister, said he didn't see why it should be a problem for waitressing work. He was the first person to give me a chance. Made a mental note of the name. And how do you find it, the physical demands? Harder than I expected, Kenya admitted. But not impossible. I've learned to balance trays differently, and I'm getting faster at navigating around tables. The other staff, she paused, choosing her words carefully. They're still getting used to me, I think. Glanced again at the employees near the kitchen, who were now pointedly ignoring their table, but whose body language spoke volumes about their feelings regarding Kenya's presence. How do you stay so positive? He asked. After everything you've been through. Kenya was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she looked up, her eyes held a depth that seemed far beyond her years. Because the alternative is giving up, she said simply. And I refuse to let one drunk driver's bad decision define the rest of my life. I may not become the surgeon I plan to be, but that doesn't mean I can't find another way to make a difference. Maybe I'll go back to school part-time and become a nurse. Maybe I'll learn a trade. Maybe I'll start my own business someday. The point is, I'm still here, I'm still fighting, and I'm not going to stop. Felt something shift inside his chest. In his world of billion-dollar deals and corporate boardrooms, he met many people who talked about determination and drive. But most of them had never faced real adversity. They spoke of challenges that were really just inconveniences, setbacks that were cushioned by family money or connections or safety nets that Kenya clearly didn't have. This young woman was showing him what real courage looked like. Time's up, Kenya. A sharp voice called from across the diner. Both and Kenya looked toward the kitchen, where a heavy-set man in his 40s was standing with his arms crossed. His name tag read Steve, Assistant Manager, and his expression made it clear that Kenya's break was over whether she was ready or not. "I have to get back to work," Kenya said, reaching for her crutch. "Thank you again for letting me sit with you. I really appreciate it." "Wait," said as she started to stand. "Would it be okay if I asked you something?" Kenya paused, looking curious. "Sure." "What would you do if money wasn't an issue? I mean, if you could do anything at all with your life, what would it be?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She sat back down for a moment, her eyes distant as she considered her answer. "You know what's funny?" she said finally. "Before the accident, I was so focused on becoming a surgeon that I never really thought about other ways to help people. But being in the hospital for so long, being around other patients who were struggling with disabilities and chronic illnesses, I realized there's a huge gap in the healthcare system. Not just medical care, but support services, counseling, job training, advocacy, connecting people with resources." She paused, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I've actually been thinking about starting a nonprofit organization, something that would help people navigate life after a major injury or illness. Not just the medical stuff, but the practical things, how to find employment, how to modify your living space, how to deal with insurance companies, how to rebuild your confidence and sense of purpose." Found himself nodding. "That sounds like it could help a lot of people." "It could," Kenya agreed, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "There are so many people who fall through the cracks because they don't know what resources are available or how to access them. And the existing organizations are often overwhelmed and underfunded. But with the right approach, the right team—" "Kenya," Steve's voice was sharper now, with an edge of impatience. "I really have to go," Kenya said, standing quickly and reaching for her crutch. "But thank you for listening. It was nice to talk to someone about something other than coffee orders and breakfast specials." Watched her make her way back to the kitchen area, noting how she navigated smoothly around obstacles despite her crutch. He also noticed how the other employees watched her with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. When returned with his breakfast a few minutes later, found himself asking, "What do you think of the new waitress?" Glanced toward Kenya, who was now taking an order at a table near the window. "She seems sweet," said carefully. "Hard worker from what I can tell. Some of the others—" She trailed off, clearly not wanting to gossip about her. "Some of the others what?" Pressed gently. Sighed. "Look, I've been working in restaurants for 30 years. I've seen all kinds of people come and go. That girl has something special. She's polite, she's trying her best, and she doesn't complain. But change makes some people nervous, especially when they think someone might not be able to pull their weight." "Do you think she can handle the job?" asked. "Honestly, I think she might be better at it than some of the people who've been here for years," said. "She pays attention to details, she's friendly with customers, and she's not afraid to work hard. The only question is whether management will give her a fair chance to prove herself." Nodded thoughtfully, but before he could respond, A commotion near the kitchen caught his attention. Kenya was standing at the service window, apparently having some kind of disagreement with the cook. Her voice was too quiet to hear, but the cook, a burly man with tattoos covering his forearms, was speaking loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "I don't care what told you," the cook was saying. "This is a fast-paced kitchen, and we can't be slowing down because someone can't keep up. Either you find a way to move faster or you find another job." Kenya's response was too quiet to make out, but her posture suggested she was trying to remain calm and professional. The cook, however, was just getting started. "And another thing, we've had 3 customers complain about slow service since you started. That's 3 complaints in one day. You think going to keep you around when customers start taking their business elsewhere?" Felt his jaw clench. He had been watching Kenya work for the past hour, and while she was perhaps not quite as fast as the more experienced waitresses, she was certainly not slow enough to warrant complaints. More importantly, her interactions with customers had been universally positive from what he could observe. Something about this situation didn't feel right. Pulled out his phone and quietly opened the voice recording app. If there was discrimination happening here, he wanted documentation. His legal team had taught him the importance of evidence in situations like this. The conversation at the service window continued, with the cook becoming increasingly aggressive and Kenya maintaining her professional demeanor despite what was clearly a hostile work environment. Other employees were watching the exchange with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly supportive of the cook's position. When Kenya finally walked away from the kitchen and began making rounds to check on her tables, noticed that her composure was beginning to crack slightly. Her movements were more rigid, and she kept her eyes focused straight ahead as she navigated between tables. As she passed his booth, caught her eye and offered what he hoped was an encouraging smile. She managed a small smile in return, but he could see the stress and hurt in her expression. "Made a decision." He pulled out his business card and wrote a brief note on the back. When Kenya returned to refill his coffee cup, he discreetly handed her the card. "If you ever want to talk more about that nonprofit idea," he said quietly, "give me a call. I might know some people who could help." Kenya glanced at the card, and her eyes widened slightly as she read his name and the logo of his company. Williams, CEO of Williams Hospitality Group. She looked up at him with surprise and curiosity, but before she could say anything, Steve appeared at their table. "Is there a problem here?" Steve asked, his tone suggesting that any problem would automatically be Kenya's fault. "No problem at all," said smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Just complimenting the excellent service." Steve looked between them suspiciously, but couldn't find any reason to object. "Well, Kenya, you need to get back to your section. Table 6 has been waiting for their check for 10 minutes. Kenya nodded and moved away quickly, but noticed her slip his business card into her apron pocket. For the next 20 minutes, watched the dynamics of the restaurant with the analytical eye he usually reserved for business negotiations. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Kenya was being set up to fail. The cook was deliberately slow with her orders, causing her tables to wait longer than necessary. Other staff members forgot to refill supplies in her section, forcing her to make extra trips to the storage room. When customers needed assistance that required two people, like moving tables or carrying large orders, the other employees suddenly became too busy to help. It was a textbook case of workplace harassment designed to force someone to quit. Finished his breakfast and left a generous tip, making sure saw the amount. As he stood to leave, he caught Kenya's eye one more time and pointed subtly to his apron pocket where she had stored his business card. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding his message. As walked toward the exit, he heard Steve's voice behind him. "Kenya, table 4 says they've been waiting 15 minutes for their pancakes. What's the holdup?" Paused at the door and looked back. Kenya was standing at table 4, apparently explaining the delay to a couple who looked more confused than angry. From his vantage point, could see table 4's order ticket hanging in the service window. It had been ready for several minutes, but the cook was deliberately ignoring it. The injustice of the situation made his blood pressure rise. He had built his fortune partly by recognizing talent and potential in unexpected places. He had also learned to identify when people were being treated unfairly, usually because he had experienced his own share of discrimination early in his career. But this situation was different. This wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. Pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Jennifer, I need you to clear my schedule for this afternoon. Something's come up that requires my immediate attention." "Sir, you have the board meeting with the group at 3, and the charity dinner tonight." "Reschedule the meeting and make my apologies for the dinner. Send a check for whatever my usual contribution would have been." Was already walking toward his car. "And Jennifer, I need you to run a complete background check on someone. Kenya Johnson, probably in her mid-20s, lives somewhere in the Chicago area. I want to know everything: education, employment history, medical records if you can get them legally, family situation, financial status. Everything." "Yes, sir. May I ask what this is regarding?" Paused as he reached his car, looking back at the diner where he could see Kenya still trying to manage an impossible situation with grace and professionalism. "It's regarding a business opportunity," he said finally. "One that might be more important than anything else on my schedule." As drove toward his downtown office, his mind was already working through possibilities. He had built his empire by recognizing potential where others saw problems, by investing in people when others saw only risk. Every successful business venture started with identifying an unmet need and finding the right person to address it. Kenya Johnson had just described a significant unmet need in the healthcare support system. She had also demonstrated the kind of character and determination that made for successful entrepreneurs. The only thing she lacked was opportunity. Williams was very good at providing opportunities. By the time he reached his office building, he had already begun formulating a plan. It would require some research, some legal groundwork, and very careful execution. But if everything checked out the way he suspected it would, Kenya Johnson was about to discover that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the question, "Can I sit with you?" changes everything. As rode the elevator to his penthouse office, he found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He had forgotten how good it felt to use his resources and influence for something that Williams stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking out at the Chicago skyline while his assistant Jennifer compiled the information he had requested. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city, and from his position on the 42nd floor, the people below looked like ants going about their daily business. But's mind wasn't on the view. It was on a young woman balancing on one leg in a small diner, asking if she could sit down for just a moment. "Sir," Jennifer's voice came through the intercom, "I have the preliminary information you requested." "Come in," said, turning away from the window. Jennifer had been executive assistant for 8 years. She was efficient, discreet, and had an uncanny ability to find information that others couldn't. At 45, she had worked for 3 Fortune 500 CEOs before, and he had learned to trust her judgment implicitly. "This is interesting," Jennifer said, settling into the chair across from his desk with a thick folder. "Kenya Johnson, age 24, originally from Detroit. Full academic scholarship to university, pre-med track with a 3.8 GPA. She was in her junior year when the accident happened." Sat down behind his massive desk. "Tell me about the accident." "March 15th of last year. She was driving home from a late-night study session at the library when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car on the driver's side. The other driver was going 60 in a 35 zone." Jennifer flipped through pages of documents. "Kenya was trapped in the wreckage for 45 minutes before emergency responders could extract her." "Injuries?" "Severe. Crushed left leg, internal bleeding, broken ribs, concussion. She had 6 surgeries over 4 months, including eventually having her leg amputated below the knee when infections set in, and they couldn't save it." Felt his jaw tighten. "What about the other driver?" "Timothy, age 38. He walked away with minor injuries. This was his 3rd DUI offense. He's currently serving a 7-year sentence for vehicular assault, but he was also essentially judgment-proof. No assets, no insurance, no way to pay for Kenya's medical expenses. So she got nothing. Worse than nothing. She had student health insurance, but it only covered 60% of costs after deductibles. The total medical bills exceeded $400,000. She had to declare bankruptcy just to stop the collection calls." Made a note on his legal pad. "Family situation." "That's where it gets more complicated," Jennifer said, pulling out another set of documents. "Her parents died in a house fire when she was 16. She's been living with her grandmother, Dolores Johnson, ever since. Mrs. Johnson raised 5 children as a single mother while working as a hospital custodian, put 3 of them through college. She's now 72 and living on Social Security and a small pension. So Kenya's been supporting herself since high school. With help from her grandmother, but yes, Work-study programs, summer jobs, tutoring. She was completely self-sufficient until the accident. Held her spot for 1 semester, hoping she would recover quickly enough to return, but 4 months in the hospital meant she missed too much to catch up. Exactly. And without her scholarship, there was no way to afford tuition anyway. The scholarship was merit-based but also need-based. Once she from classes, it was gone permanently. Leaned back in his chair, processing the information. What about job prospects after she recovered? Jennifer's expression grew grim. That's where the story gets more frustrating. I found applications she submitted to 47 different employers over the past 6 months. Administrative assistant positions, data entry, customer service, receptionist work, nothing too physically demanding. Based on her education, background, and grades, she should have been a strong candidate for any of those positions. But out of 47 applications, she got exactly 3 interviews. And all 3 ended the same way, promising initial conversations followed by sudden decisions to go with another candidate once they met her in person. A discrimination. Almost certainly, though proving it would be nearly impossible. But here's the really interesting part. Jennifer pulled out a separate file. I did some digging into her background before the accident, and this young woman was remarkable. She volunteered at 3 different organizations, a homeless shelter, a literacy program for adults, and a support group for trauma survivors. She tutored struggling students for free, organized fundraisers for other students facing financial hardship, and somehow maintained a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week. Found himself nodding. She mentioned wanting to start a nonprofit. That makes sense, according to her college professors. And yes, I spoke to several of them. Kenya Johnson had exceptional emotional intelligence and leadership abilities. Her organic chemistry professor said she was the kind of student who made everyone around her better. Her psychology professor described her as having unusual insight into human behavior and motivation. They remember her that well after a year. She made an impression. Dr. Sarah Martinez in the psychology department said Kenya was one of those rare students who understood that medicine wasn't just about treating diseases. It was about treating people. She apparently wrote a paper about the psychological challenges facing trauma survivors that Dr. Martinez still uses as an example for current students. Made more notes. What about her current living situation? She and her grandmother live in a 2-bedroom apartment inn. It's a decent neighborhood, not fancy but safe. Mrs. Johnson has lived there for 15 years, and the rent is reasonable because it's rent-controlled housing for seniors. But it's a 3rd-floor walk-up, which has been challenging for Kenya since the accident. I imagine so. The building doesn't have an elevator, so Kenya has to navigate 3 flights of stairs every day with her prosthetic leg. The superintendent told me, and I hope you don't mind that I posed as someone checking references for a potential employer, that Kenya never complains, always pays her portion of the rent on time, and has actually helped other elderly residents in the building with things like grocery shopping and technology problems. I smiled slightly. She can't help herself, can she? Always helping others. Apparently not, which brings me to the most interesting part of my research. Jennifer pulled out a final folder. I found some information about her current workplace situation that you're going to want to hear. I'm listening. Sunrise Diner is owned by Restaurant Group, which operates 6 similar establishments around the city. David, the owner, has a generally good reputation as an employer, fair wages, decent benefits for full-time employees, low turnover rates. But there have been some issues at the Sunrise location specifically. What kind of issues? Steve, the assistant manager Kenya mentioned, has been written up twice in the past year for creating hostile work environments. Once for making inappropriate comments to a female employee, and once for what was described as discriminatory behavior toward an older worker who was eventually forced to quit. Felt his anger building again. So there's a pattern. It appears so, and here's the thing I spoke to directly. He hired Kenya specifically because he was impressed by her attitude and determination during the interview. He has a cousin with a disability, and he wanted to give her a chance, but has been the assistant manager at that location for 3 years and doesn't spend much time on site. He relies on to manage day-to-day operations, so doesn't know what's happening. Based on my conversation with him, no. He asked how Kenya was working out, which suggests he hasn't received negative reports. But he also hasn't received any positive reports, which is concerning given that most new employees get some kind of feedback to the owner during their first week. Stood up and began packing behind his desk. This was exactly the kind of situation that made his blood boil, talented people being held back by small-minded individuals who couldn't see past their own prejudices. "What else do I need to know?" he asked. "Well, I did some research on the nonprofit idea she mentioned to you. Organizations that provide comprehensive support services for people recovering from major injuries or illnesses. There are a few national organizations that do this kind of work, but they're chronically underfunded and understaffed. Most focus on specific types of injuries, spinal cord, brain trauma, amputation, rather than taking a holistic approach. So there really is a gap in services. A significant one. And based on Kenya's educational background, her personal experience, and what her professors told me about her abilities, she would be well positioned to address that gap. The only things she lacks are startup capital and business knowledge. Stopped packing and looked at Jennifer. Things I could provide. Things you could provide, she confirmed. But I have to ask, what's your end game here? This isn't like your usual investments. Kenya Johnson isn't asking for help, and she doesn't even know who you really are beyond the business card you gave her. It was a fair question. Had built his fortune through calculated investments in proven business models. Hotels, real estate, technology companies, all sectors where he understood the markets and could predict returns with reasonable accuracy. Funding a nonprofit organization run by a young woman with no business experience was about as far from his usual investment strategy as possible. But Jennifer was wrong about one thing. This wasn't entirely unlike his usual investments. Had always been drawn to opportunities where he could see potential that others missed. His first hotel had been a rundown property that everyone said was hopeless. His first technology investment had been in a company that 3 other investors had turned down. His specialty was finding diamonds in the rough. Kenya Johnson was definitely a diamond in the rough. My end game, said finally, is to do something meaningful with my money. I've spent 15 years building wealth, and for what? So I can buy another house I'll never visit, another car I'll drive once a month, another piece of art that sits in storage. He walked back to the window, looking out at the city again. Jennifer, I've been successful because I learned to recognize potential. That young woman has more potential in her little finger than most of the MBAs I meet in boardrooms. She's just never had someone give her a real chance. And you want to be that someone. I want to be that someone, confirmed. But I want to do it right. I don't want to swoop in like some kind of savior and hand her a check. I want to create an opportunity for her to succeed on her own merits. Jennifer nodded slowly. What did you have in mind? Returned to his desk and pulled out a legal pad. I'm thinking about a multi-step approach. First, we need to address the immediate problem, her work situation. She can't build anything if she's being harassed out of her current job. How do you want to handle that? Carefully. If we come on too strong, it could backfire and make things worse for her. But if we do nothing, she's going to be forced out within a week or two. Made notes as he talked. I think we start with a conversation with, not about Kenya specifically, but about management practices at his restaurants. Frame it as a potential business partnership discussion. You're thinking about investing in his restaurant group. I'm thinking about appearing to think about investing in his restaurant group. He's been looking for capital to expand. I saw the trade publication article about his plans for 3 new locations. If he thinks I'm a potential investor, he'll be very interested in ensuring his current operations are running smoothly. Jennifer smiled. And if you happen to mention that you've been impressed by the service at the Sunrise location during your casual visits, then he might decide to pay a surprise visit to see how things are running, and if he sees management style firsthand. The problem solved without you having to directly intervene. Exactly. Kenya keeps her job, gets a better sense of what's happening at that location, and either changes his behavior or finds himself looking for new employment. Made more notes. Step 2 is the bigger challenge. I want to help Kenya develop her nonprofit idea, but I need to do it in a way that doesn't make her feel like charity case. Oh, what are you thinking? A business incubator program. Williams Hospitality Group announces a new initiative to support innovative nonprofit startups focused on community service. We invite applications, set up a competitive selection process, and provide funding, mentorship, and business support to the winners. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. A completely legitimate program that happens to be perfectly suited for someone with Kenya's background and interests. A completely legitimate program, confirmed. That will help multiple worthy organizations while giving Kenya the opportunity to compete for support on a level playing field. And if her application isn't selected, then I'll find another way to help her. But Jennifer, based on what you've told me about her background and abilities, I don't think that's going to be a problem. If she can present her ideas clearly and demonstrate her commitment, she'll stand out from other applicants. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. "This could work," she said finally, "but it's going to require some significant investment on your part. Setting up a legitimate incubator program, hiring staff to run it, providing ongoing support to multiple organizations. We're talking about millions of dollars over several years." "I'm aware of that. And there's no guarantee of financial return. Nonprofit organizations don't generate profits that can be shared with investors." Smiled. "Jennifer, I'm worth almost $3 billion. I think I can afford to invest in something that might actually make the world a better place, even if it doesn't make me any richer." "All right, then. Where do you want to start?" Looked at his calendar. "Set up a lunch meeting with David for tomorrow. Tell him I'm interested in discussing potential partnership opportunities in the restaurant industry. Then start working on a framework for the nonprofit incubator program. I want to announce it within 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Setting up a program like this usually takes months. "Then we'll hire the best consultants and lawyers and accountants we can find to make it happen faster. Money has its advantages." Stood up. "And Jennifer, I want to go back to Sunrise Diner this afternoon. Unofficially. I want to see what happens during the lunch rush." "You're going back in disguise." Laughed. "Nothing that dramatic. Just different clothes, sit at a different table, observe the dynamics. If I'm going to invest in changing Kenya's situation, I need to fully understand what we're dealing with." After Jennifer left to begin making arrangements, stood alone in his office, looking out at the city. In the distance, he could see the neighborhood where Sunrise Diner was located, where a young woman was probably struggling through her lunch shift while wondering if the business card in her apron pocket represented a real opportunity or just another disappointment. Had a good feeling about Kenya Johnson. More than that, he had the same instinct that had guided his most successful business decisions. The sense that he was looking at something special, something that could grow into something remarkable with the right support and opportunity. He thought about the question she had asked him that morning, "Can I sit with you?" It occurred to him that maybe the real question was, "Can I stand with you?" Williams was about to find out. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, was sitting in the back corner of Sunrise Diner wearing jeans, a university sweatshirt, and a baseball cap. He looked like any other casual customer grabbing a late lunch, and none of the staff had recognized him from his morning visits. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about Kenya's work situation. The lunch rush was in full swing, and the diner was packed with customers. Kenya was working her section with obvious determination, but the obstacles being placed in her way were even more blatant than they had been that morning. Her orders were consistently the last ones prepared by the kitchen, forcing her tables to wait longer than those in other sections. When she asked for help carrying large orders, other staff members suddenly became too busy to assist. The coffee pot assigned to her section was somehow always empty when she needed it, requiring extra trips to get refills. Most troubling was the way Steve was treating her. Every few minutes, he would appear at one of her tables, ostensibly to check on customer satisfaction, but clearly hopping to find something to criticize. Watched him tell 3 different tables that their waitress was new and still learning, an unnecessary comment that undermined Kenya's confidence and professionalism. But what impressed most was how Kenya handled the pressure. She remained calm, friendly, and professional despite the obvious harassment. When a customer complained about the slow service, she apologized sincerely without making excuses. When criticized her in front of customers, she accepted the feedback gracefully and moved on. She was, realized, exactly the kind of person he would want representing any business he owned. As he finished his lunch and prepared to leave, made a decision. Tomorrow's conversation with was important, but Kenya needed support right now. He couldn't wait for bureaucratic processes to play out. Left a substantial tip and walked to the register to pay his check. Was working the cash register and took the opportunity to engage him in conversation. "Great place you've got here," said as rang up his order. "Thanks," replied without much enthusiasm. "First time in." "Actually, no. I've been coming here occasionally for a few months, usually in the mornings, but I had a late meeting nearby today." Handed over his credit card. "The service has always been excellent." "Yeah, well, we do our best." Stone suggested he didn't particularly care about customer feedback. "I was especially impressed with my waitress today," continued. "Kenya, I think, very professional, very attentive. You're lucky to have someone like that on your team." As expression shifted slightly. "She's new, still learning the ropes." "Really, she seemed very experienced to me. I'm in the hospitality industry myself, so I notice these things. She has exactly the kind of customer service skills that are hard to teach." Watched's face carefully. The assistant manager was clearly uncomfortable with the positive feedback about Kenya, but he couldn't disagree without seeming unprofessional. "Well, we'll see how she works out," said finally, handing his receipt. "I'm sure she'll do great," replied. "Places like this succeed because of employees who care about doing a good job. I hope management recognizes that." As left the diner, he saw looking troubled. The message had been delivered. Customers were paying attention to Kenya's performance, and they liked what they saw. That evening, called Jennifer from his penthouse apartment. "How did the meeting setup go?" he asked. "All arranged. Lunch tomorrow at—" He was very excited about the possibility of discussing expansion funding. "Good, and the incubator program. I've got 3 different consulting firms working on framework proposals. We should have preliminary structures by Friday." "Excellent." Looked out at the lights of the city. "Jennifer, I need you to do one more thing. I want you to research other employees at Sunrise Diner who might have experienced discrimination or harassment. If we're going to address the management problem there, I want to make sure we're not just fixing things for Kenya." "Already on it," Jennifer said. "I've identified 2 former employees who might be willing to discuss their experiences, and I'm reaching out through intermediaries." Smiled. This was why Jennifer was the best assistant he'd ever had. She was always 3 steps ahead. One more thing, he added. I want you to draft a letter for my signature. It should introduce Williams Hospitality Group's new nonprofit incubator program and invite applications from qualified candidates. Make sure the criteria are broad enough to include Kenya's idea but specific enough to attract serious applicants. When do you want to announce the program? Thought for a moment. Let's give it one more week. I want to see how the situation develops first. But I want everything ready to go as soon as we've addressed Kenya's immediate employment situation. After ending the call, poured himself a glass of wine and stood at his living room window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Kenya Johnson was probably having dinner with her grandmother, perhaps sharing the events of her difficult day at work. Maybe she was looking at his business card and wondering whether she should call. Hoped she would call. He was looking forward to their next conversation. But more than that, he was looking forward to seeing what Kenya Johnson David set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair at, one of Chicago's most prestigious restaurants. Across the table, Williams was discussing potential investment opportunities in the restaurant industry with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from years of successful business ventures. I have to admit, said, I wasn't expecting someone with your background to be interested in small restaurant operations. Most investors your level are looking at national chains or celebrity chef concepts. Smiled. I've learned that the best investments often come from understanding what makes businesses work at the ground level. Your operation has caught my attention because you seem to focus on consistent quality and employee satisfaction rather than flashy concepts. That's always been my philosophy, agreed. Happy employees provide better service, which creates loyal customers, which generates steady profits. It's not complicated, but it's not always easy to execute. How do you ensure consistent management across your different locations? Asked, cutting into his perfectly prepared beef. That's often where multi-location restaurant groups struggle. Paused, considering the question. I try to visit each location regularly, but I'll admit it's a challenge. I rely heavily on my assistant managers to maintain standards when I'm not on site. And how's that working out? Mostly well, said, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. I have strong managers at most locations. There have been a few personnel challenges recently, but nothing that can't be addressed. Sensed an opening. What kind of personnel challenges, if you don't mind me asking? I've found that management issues can often be early indicators of systemic problems. Was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to share with a potential investor. Well, to be completely honest, I've had some concerns about the management style at one of my locations. Nothing dramatic, but there have been some employee turnover issues that don't fit the pattern at my other restaurants. A high turnover is expensive, observed. Training costs, recruitment costs, loss of customer relationships with familiar staff. Exactly. And the thing is, this particular location has always been profitable, so it's easy to overlook staffing issues when the numbers look good. but I've been wondering if we might be leaving money on the table by not addressing some underlying management problems. Nodded thoughtfully. Have you considered doing some unannounced site visits? Sometimes the best way to understand what's really happening is to observe operations when management doesn't know you're watching. I've thought about it, admitted, but I hate the idea of spying on my own employees. It feels like it undermines trust. I understand that concern, said, but there's a difference between spying and quality assurance. You have a responsibility to ensure that all your locations are representing your brand properly. More importantly, you have a responsibility to ensure that your employees are being treated fairly and professionally. Looked thoughtful. You know, you might be right. I've been so focused on the financial performance that I may have overlooked some operational issues. Which location are you concerned about? Asked casually. The Sunrise Diner on Ashland Avenue. It's been my most profitable location for the past 2 years, but I've noticed some inconsistencies in employee retention lately. Nothing dramatic, just small things that make me wonder if there might be management issues I'm not seeing. Felt a surge of satisfaction. Was already questioning what was happening at Kenya's workplace without any direct prompting. Well, said, if you're serious about expanding your operation, one thing I always look for in potential investments is consistent management quality across all locations. It might be worth taking a closer look at that situation before we move forward with any partnership discussions. Nodded slowly. That's good advice. I think I'll plan some surprise visits over the next week or two, get a better sense of what's really happening on the ground. They spent the rest of lunch discussing expansion possibilities, financing options, and long-term vision for his restaurant group. Was genuinely impressed by his commitment to employee welfare and community involvement. This wasn't a man who would tolerate discrimination or harassment if he knew it was happening. By the time they finished lunch, had agreed to provide with detailed operational and financial information for all 6 of his restaurants, and had expressed serious interest in potentially funding a 3-location expansion. I'll get you those reports by Friday, said as they shook hands outside the restaurant. And thank you for the advice about management oversight. You're absolutely right that I need to be more hands-on with operational quality assurance. I look forward to reviewing the information, replied. And David, I have a good feeling about the potential for partnership here. Your operation has exactly the kind of solid foundation that makes for successful expansion. As drove away, pulled out his phone and called Jennifer. How did it go? She asked immediately. Better than expected. Is already suspicious about management issues at the Sunrise location, and he's planning unannounced visits within the next week. I think we can expect behavior to come to light very quickly. That's good news. What about the expansion funding? I'm genuinely considering it, said. Seems like a decent businessman who cares about his employees. If he addresses the management problems and demonstrates that he can maintain quality across multiple locations, he might be worth investing in legitimately. And the incubator program. How are the framework proposals coming? I have preliminary structures from all three consulting firms. The most promising approach comes from strategic ironic name, considering our current situation. They're proposing a competitive application process with quarterly cohorts, comprehensive business mentorship, and graduated funding based on milestone achievement. Smiled as he walked toward his car. Perfect. Set up a meeting with Strategic for tomorrow morning. I want to have the program framework finalized by Friday so we can announce it next week. That evening, found himself back at Sunrise Diner for dinner. He had told himself he was just checking to see how Kenya was handling the dinner shift. But honestly, he was becoming invested in her success in a way that went beyond business calculations. He arrived at 6:30 p.m. and was seated in a different section, served by. But he could observe Kenya working across the restaurant, and what he saw confirmed his positive impression of her abilities. Despite the continued harassment from and the lack of support from other staff members, Kenya had developed strategies for managing her workload efficiently. She had learned to anticipate which orders would be delayed by the kitchen and proactively communicated with her tables to manage expectations. She had figured out how to carry multiple plates safely while using her crutch, and she moved through the restaurant with a grace that made her disability almost invisible. Most importantly, her customers clearly liked her, watched table after table respond positively to her friendly professionalism. Several customers specifically asked to be seated in her section when they arrived. As was finishing his dinner, he overheard a conversation at the table next to him that made his blood run cold. "I'm telling you, she's not going to last another week," one of the kitchen staff was saying to another employee during their break. "'s got it in for her, and he's not going to stop until she quits." "What's his problem with her anyway?" the other employee asked. "You know how he is. He doesn't think disabled people should be working in restaurants. Says it makes customers uncomfortable and slows everything down. He's been trying to document every little mistake so he can fire her with cause." "Well, that's messed up. She seems nice and she's definitely trying hard." "Doesn't matter. It's the assistant manager and almost never comes around. As long as the numbers look good, doesn't ask questions about staffing decisions." Felt his jaw clench. This confirmed his worst fears about the situation. Wasn't just creating a hostile work environment, he was actively trying to build a case for termination. Time was running out. Paid his check and left the restaurant, but instead of going home, he drove to his office. If was planning surprise visits over the next week, wanted to make sure those visits happened sooner rather than later. He called his personal cell phone. "David, it's Williams. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about our conversation today, particularly about the management oversight issue. I was wondering if you might be free tomorrow afternoon for a casual visit to one of your locations. I'd like to see your operation in action before we move forward with partnership discussions." "That's a great idea," said enthusiastically. "Which location were you thinking?" "Well, since you mentioned having concerns about the Sunrise location, Maybe we should start there. Get a sense of whether those concerns are justified or if it's just normal operational variation. There was a pause. You know what? That's perfect timing. I was planning to visit there later this week anyway, but tomorrow afternoon would work even better. Around 2:00 p.m. Perfect. Should I meet you there? Actually, why don't we go together? You can pick me up at my office and we'll arrive unannounced. That way we'll get a more authentic picture of daily operations. Smiled, excellent plan. I'll see you at 1:30. After ending the call, sat in his office for several minutes, thinking about what tomorrow might bring. Seemed genuinely committed to fair management practices, but he was about to discover that one of his assistant managers had been systematically harassing an employee based on her disability. The question was, what would do with that information? Hoped he was right about's character. Kenya Johnson deserved to work in an environment where she was judged on her abilities, not her physical limitations. The next afternoon picked up at his office, and they drove to Sunrise Diner together. Seemed slightly nervous about the unannounced visit, which took as a good sign. It suggested he genuinely cared about what they might find. They arrived at 2:15 p.m., right in the middle of the afternoon rush. As they entered the restaurant, could immediately see the tension in Kenya's posture. She was working her section efficiently, but was hovering nearby, clearly looking for something to criticize. Chose a table in Kenya's section, and was interested to see how the interaction would play out. "Welcome to Sunrise Diner," Kenya said warmly as she approached their table with menus. "Can I start you with something to drink?" If she recognized, she didn't show it. Her professionalism was impeccable. "A coffee for both of us," said, studying Kenya's face. "And we'll need a few minutes to look at the menu." "Of course," Kenya replied. "I'll be right back with your coffee." As Kenya moved away from their table, watched her navigate around other customers with her crutch. "Is she new?" he asked quietly. "I believe so," replied carefully. "This is only my second time in this section." They watched Kenya work for the next few minutes, taking orders, delivering food, and checking on customers. Her service was attentive and friendly, and could see taking mental notes about her interactions with customers. Then appeared Kenya, he called out across the restaurant, his voice loud enough for every customer to hear. "Table 12 still doesn't have their side of hash browns. How long does it take to deliver one order?" Kenya looked toward table 12, then back at, "I put that order in 15 minutes ago, Steve. It should be ready." "Well, it's not ready, and the customer is getting impatient. You need to follow up with the kitchen and make sure your orders are being prioritized correctly." Watched expression carefully. The restaurant owner was frowning, clearly uncomfortable with public criticism of an employee. Kenya walked to the service window to check on the order and could see her speaking quietly with the cook. A moment later, she returned to table 12 with the missing hash browns and what appeared to be a sincere apology. "How long has that young woman been working here?" asked quietly. "I'm not sure," replied. but she seems to handle difficult situations very professionally. Nodded, but his attention was now focused on, who was continuing to watch Kenya with obvious disapproval. Over the next 30 minutes, and witnessed a pattern of behavior that made increasingly uncomfortable. Repeatedly criticized Kenya for minor issues while ignoring similar or worse mistakes by other staff members. He made unnecessary comments to customers about her being new and still learning. Most, he seemed to be deliberately creating obstacles for her success. The breaking point came when Kenya was carrying a large tray of food to a 6-person table. She was managing the heavy load carefully with her crutch when suddenly stepped into her path, ostensibly to speak with another employee, but clearly positioned to force Kenya to navigate around him. As Kenya adjusted her balance to avoid, he turned and spoke loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "You need to be more careful with those trays. We can't afford to have accidents because someone can't handle the physical demands of the job." The comment was clearly intended to humiliate Kenya in front of customers, and saw her face flush with embarrassment. But instead of responding defensively, she simply said, "You're right, Steve. I'll be more careful," and continued to her table. His face had gone completely still. Watched as the restaurant owner observed his assistant manager's behavior with growing anger. This was clearly not the management style expected or tolerated in his restaurants. When Kenya approached their table to refill their coffee, spoke to her directly. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. Kenya looked slightly surprised by the question. "This is my 4th day, sir." "And how are you finding the work environment?" Kenya glanced quickly toward who was watching their interaction with obvious suspicion. "It's challenging," she said carefully, "but I'm learning a lot." "I'm sure you are," said meaningfully. "Thank you for the excellent service today." After Kenya moved away from their table, turned to with an expression of barely controlled anger. "I need to have a private conversation with my assistant manager," he said quietly. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes?" Nodded and stood up and walked toward with the determined stride of someone who had seen enough. Couldn't hear the conversation that followed, but he could see it clearly from his table. Spoke quietly but intensely, too, gesturing occasionally toward Kenya and toward the customers who had witnessed his behavior. His initial defensive posture gradually shifted to something that looked like panic as he realized his boss had observed his management style firsthand. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, after which walked quickly toward the back office while returned to the table. "I think I've seen enough," said grimly. "I owe you an apology. The concerns I mentioned about this location were clearly much more serious than I realized." "What happens now?" asked. "Now I have some very difficult decisions to make about staffing and management practices." Signaled for their check. "But first, I need to have some conversations with other employees to understand the full scope of the problem." As they prepared to leave, approached Kenya's table one more time. "Excuse me," he said. "I didn't introduce myself earlier. I'm David, the owner of this restaurant." Kenya's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, mister, it's nice to meet you, sir. I want you to know that the service we received today was exceptional," said. "Professional, friendly, and attentive. Exactly the kind of service I want all my customers to experience." "Thank you, sir. I really appreciate this job opportunity." "You're welcome, and I want you to know that if you ever have any concerns about your work environment, you can contact me directly." Handed her his business card. "My personal number is on the back." As they left the restaurant, could see Kenya looking at's business card with a mixture of relief and hope. "That was eye-opening," said as they got into his car. "I had no idea that kind of behavior was happening in my restaurant." "What are you going to do about?" asked. "Is finished," said flatly. "I will not tolerate discrimination or harassment in any of my establishments. But first, I need to document everything properly and make sure I understand the full extent of the problem." And Kenya Johnson is exactly the kind of employee I want representing my restaurants. Professional, resilient, and committed to providing excellent customer service despite facing unnecessary obstacles. Shook his head. "I can't believe I let this situation develop without being aware of it." "You can't be everywhere at once," pointed out. "The important thing is that you're addressing it now." "You're right, and I want to thank you for encouraging me to take a closer look at this location. If we're going to be business partners, I want you to know that this kind of management problem will never be tolerated in any expansion operations." Smiled. "I'm very glad to hear that, David." As drove back to his office, he felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond successful business negotiations. Kenya Johnson's immediate employment crisis was about to be resolved, and had proven himself to be the kind of business owner who deserved investment support. But the larger opportunity was still ahead. That evening was working late in his office when Jennifer knocked on his door. "The incubator program framework is finalized," she announced, setting a thick folder on his desk. "Strategic has created a comprehensive structure that should attract high-quality applicants while providing the kind of support that successful nonprofit organizations need." Opened the folder and began reviewing the proposal. It was impressive. A competitive application process, comprehensive business mentorship, graduated funding based on milestone achievement, and ongoing support for organizational development. "This looks excellent," said after reviewing the key points. "When can we announce the program?" "We can make the public announcement on Monday if you approve the final structure. Applications would be due in 6 weeks, with the first cohort beginning 3 months from now." Nodded. Perfect timing. Kenya's employment situation should be stable by then, and she'll have had time to develop her nonprofit proposal properly. "Speaking of Kenya," Jennifer said, "I have some additional information you might find interesting." He looked up from the folder. "I spoke with her professors again, this time specifically about her nonprofit idea. Dr. Martinez in the psychology department was so intrigued that she's offered to serve as an academic advisor for Kenya's project, PRO. She believes Kenya's combination of personal experience, academic background, and natural leadership abilities could create a truly innovative approach to post-trauma support services. That's excellent news. And there's more. I reached out to several established nonprofits in related fields, and 3 of them have expressed interest in potential collaboration or mentorship opportunities. Kenya's idea isn't just good, it's filling a real gap in current services. Felt the familiar excitement that came with recognizing a significant opportunity. Everything was coming together perfectly. Jennifer, I want you to draft the final version of the program announcement. Include specific language about supporting innovative approaches to community health and wellness services. Make sure the application criteria are clearly defined, but broad enough to encourage creative proposals. Already done, Jennifer said, pulling another document from her folder. I took the liberty of preparing the announcement with exactly those specifications. Read through the announcement, noting how perfectly it aligned with Kenya's interests and qualifications without being so specific as to exclude other worthy applicants. This is perfect, he said. Let's plan the public announcement for Monday morning. I want press releases to all major local media, announcements in nonprofit industry publications, and outreach to university programs that might have interested students. What about budget? The consulting firm estimated we'll need approximately $2 million for the first year of operations. Didn't hesitate. Approved. And Jennifer, I want you to set aside an additional $5 million for expansion if the program is successful. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. $7 million for a nonprofit incubator program. $7 million for an opportunity to help talented people create organizations that will improve thousands of lives, corrected. I can't think of a better use of money. As Jennifer left to finalize the program announcement, stood at his office window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Kenya Johnson was probably having dinner with her grandmother, perhaps sharing the story of how the restaurant owner had visited her workplace and praised her service. Tomorrow, she would return to work in an environment where she would be judged on her abilities rather than her limitations. Next week, she would learn about a new opportunity that could help her turn her nonprofit dreams into reality. And if everything went according to plan, within a year she would be running an organization that provided support and hope to people facing the same challenges she had overcome. Thought about the question Kenya had asked him that first morning, "Can I sit with you?" Such a simple request, but it had changed everything, for both of them. Sometimes the most important conversations began with the most unexpected questions. And sometimes asking, "Can I sit with you?" was really asking, "Can you see my potential?" Williams had learned to see potential where others saw only problems. And Kenya Johnson was about to learn that sometimes, when you ask the right question of the right person, the universe conspires to give you exactly the opportunity you need. The transformation was just beginning. 3 months later, received a handwritten letter that he would frame and keep on his office wall for the rest of his career. "Dear Mr. Williams," it began, I want to thank you for believing in possibilities when I could only see obstacles. The Williams Foundation nonprofit incubator program has given me the chance to turn my dreams into reality, and I am proud to tell you that Hope and Healing Support Services officially opened its doors last week. We are already serving 15 families in our pilot program, and we have partnerships with 3 hospitals to provide comprehensive support services for trauma survivors. This wouldn't have been possible without your vision and support. But more than that, I want to thank you for seeing my potential during that first conversation at Sunrise Diner. You didn't just invest in a business idea, you invested in a person who needed someone to believe in her. I hope that someday I can provide the same kind of transformative opportunity for someone else who just needs a chance to prove what they can do. With gratitude and determination, Kenya Johnson, Executive Director, Hope and Healing Support Services. Set the letter down and smiled. Kenya Johnson had been right about one thing. Sometimes the most important conversations happened in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the question, "Can I sit with you?" changed everything to accomplish when she finally got the chance she deserved. The next chapter of this story was about to begin why mattered. This was going to be interesting.